The crystal blue waters of Turks and Caicos stretched endlessly under the Caribbean sun, their surface broken only by gentle swells that caught the light like scattered diamonds. February 7th had dawned as the perfect day for snorkeling, warm, clear, with visibility that seemed to stretch forever into the depths. For tourists, these waters represented paradise. For the predators that had called these reefs home for millions of years, they represented something else entirely. The 55-year-old Canadian woman waded into the shallows, her underwater camera ready to capture the vibrant marine life that made these islands famous. Her husband followed close behind, both of them eager to explore the coral gardens that lay just a few yards from shore. The water was so clear they could see the sandy bottom beneath their feet, dotted with seagrass that swayed in the gentle current. But they weren't alone in these waters. Swimming lazily through the deeper channels, a 6-foot bull shark had been patrolling its territory. These apex predators were no strangers to these reefs. They'd been hunting here long before the first tourist ever set foot on these pristine beaches. Built for power and equipped with one of the most devastating bite forces in the ocean, bull sharks commanded respect from every creature in their domain. The woman spotted the shark first, its grey silhouette cutting through the water with effortless grace. Instead of the primal fear that should have flooded her system, she felt something else entirely: excitement. Here was the perfect photo opportunity, the kind of encounter that would make her social media followers gasp with envy. She'd seen the videos online, watched influencers swimming fearlessly alongside these magnificent predators, touching their dorsal fins, even grabbing their noses as they passed. How hard could it be? She swam closer, her camera extended toward the shark. The massive predator continued its patrol, seemingly unbothered by her presence. This only emboldened her further. The shark looked so peaceful, so majestic. Surely the horror stories were exaggerated. Surely she could get just a little closer, capture that perfect shot that would prove sharks weren't the monsters everyone claimed them to be. The bull shark's behavior began to change. Its movements became more erratic, its tail thrashing with increasing agitation. But the woman was too focused on her camera to notice the warning signs. She reached out, desperate to touch this apex predator, to create that viral moment that would showcase her bravery to the world. The shark's patience snapped. In an explosion of primal fury, the bull shark lunged forward, its massive jaws clamping down on both of the woman's outstretched arms. The water around them erupted in chaos as the predator's razor-sharp teeth tore through flesh and bone with horrifying efficiency. The woman's screams pierced the tropical air as the shark thrashed violently, its powerful neck muscles designed to rip and tear. Her husband watched in absolute horror from just a few feet away. The woman he loved was being savaged by a creature that had transformed from graceful swimmer to relentless killing machine in a matter of seconds. Without hesitation, he plunged into the bloodied water, screaming and splashing desperately to drive the shark away. The bull shark, satisfied that the threat had been neutralized, released its grip and vanished into the depths as suddenly as it had appeared. But the damage was already done. The woman floated in the crimson water, her arms mangled beyond recognition, bone and sinew exposed where her hands had once been. The race to save her life began immediately. Emergency responders rushed her to the local hospital, where doctors made the devastating decision that would change her life forever. One arm had to be amputated below the wrist. The other was severed halfway up her forearm. The hands that had reached out to touch a wild predator would never touch anything again. As she was airlifted back to Canada for additional treatment, investigators tried to piece together what had gone wrong. The beach was closed immediately, but by February 9th, it had reopened to tourists who seemed to have already forgotten the lesson written in blood just days before. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in the warm waters off Hawaii, another tragedy was unfolding, one that would shock the world and expose the deadly consequences of social media's glamorization of shark encounters. Ocean Ramsey had built her reputation on swimming with sharks. Her Instagram account, boasting nearly 600,000 followers, was filled with breathtaking images of her gliding alongside these apex predators, sometimes even touching them. She called herself a conservationist, claiming her close encounters helped dispel the myth that sharks were mindless killing machines. But on this particular day in 2019, Ramsey would cross a line that horrified marine biologists worldwide. The massive great white shark that appeared in her camera's viewfinder was no ordinary predator. At nearly 20 feet long and weighing an estimated 6,000 pounds, this was believed to be deep blue, possibly the largest great white shark ever recorded. The ancient female had been feeding on a rotting sperm whale carcass, her massive bulk moving through the water with the confidence of an apex predator that had ruled these oceans for millions of years. Most people would have kept their distance, content to observe this magnificent creature from a safe remove. But Ramsey saw something else, the ultimate content opportunity. The video she posted would go viral within hours. In it, Ramsey could be seen swimming directly alongside the massive shark, her hand extended to touch the predator's flank. "Beyond magic," she wrote in her caption, describing how the shark had used her boat as a scratching post and calling the ancient predator so mellow and beautiful. But marine biologists who saw the footage were horrified. "I can't believe that 'please don't grab the 18-foot-long wild predator' is something that needs to be explicitly said out loud. But here we are," David Schiffman, a respected shark researcher, told reporters. His words carried the weight of decades of scientific understanding about these apex predators. Michael Domeyer, founding director of the Marine Conservation Science Institute, was equally disturbed. "Promoting through social media that it's safe and okay to swim with these animals is irresponsible," he said. "More than 99% of sharks are not dangerous, but that happens to be one that is very dangerous." The statistics backed up his concerns. Great white sharks were responsible for more fatal, unprovoked attacks on humans than almost any other species. Around the world, there had been at least 80 recorded instances where a grey white had killed a human without provocation. These weren't mindless attacks. They were the calculated responses of apex predators defending their territory or mistaking humans for prey. But Ramsey's followers didn't see the danger. They saw only the beauty, the grace, the apparent harmony between human and predator. What they didn't understand was that they were watching a woman, gambling with forces beyond her comprehension. The day after Ramsey posted her videos, 60 people flocked to the sperm whale carcass, hoping to recreate her experience. The Hawaii Division of Conservation and Resources Enforcement was forced to issue an urgent warning. "Stay out of the water around this carcass. It is truly dangerous to be around this carcass with so much shark activity." But the damage was already done. The message had been sent to millions of followers. Sharks were safe, approachable, even touchable. The line between conservation and reckless endangerment had been obliterated in pursuit of viral fame. The influence of these viral videos would prove deadly in ways no one could have anticipated. Across the globe, people began seeking out their own shark encounters, driven by the intoxicating combination of social media fame and the desire to prove their own fearlessness. In the Mediterranean waters off Hadera, Israel, Barak Zak had seen the videos. The 40-year-old father of 4 was fascinated by marine life, and the sharks that had been frequenting the coastal waters near the power plant had become a local attraction. Unlike the massive great whites that Ramsey had encountered, these were smaller species, dusky and sandbar sharks that were typically harmless to humans. But Zach had watched the influencer videos. He'd seen people touching sharks, swimming alongside them, treating them like underwater pets. Armed with only a GoPro camera, mask, snorkel, and fins, he entered the water on what should have been a routine photography dive. The sharks were there, just as expected. Zach began filming, maintaining what he thought was a safe distance as he captured footage of the graceful predators. But something went wrong. Perhaps he moved too quickly. Perhaps the sharks were more agitated than they appeared. Perhaps the very act of filming had triggered their predatory instincts. Witnesses on shore watched in horror as the water around Zach suddenly erupted in violence. The man who had entered the water to capture beautiful footage of marine life was now fighting for his life against multiple sharks that had turned aggressive without warning. "They're biting me!" Zach screamed, his voice carrying across the water to the horrified onlookers. When the sharks moved closer, he tried to use his GoPro stick to push them away, just as he'd seen in the viral videos. But the flimsy plastic was no match for predators that had evolved to kill. "They're eating him, eating the man," one witness cried, the terror in their voice captured on disturbing video that would later circulate on social media. Zach was dragged further from shore, his screams growing weaker as the sharks continued their attack. By the time rescue teams arrived, there was nothing left but bloodied water and the terrible knowledge that another life had been lost to the deadly illusion that sharks were harmless. The search for his remains would continue for nearly 24 hours. When pieces of his body were finally recovered, they served as a grim reminder of what happens when social media fantasy collides with biological reality. Zach's family would later deny rumors that he had been trying to feed the sharks, as others had been filmed doing at the same beach. He had simply wanted to photograph them, inspired by the countless videos showing people swimming peacefully alongside these apex predators. His death would mark just the third recorded shark attack in Israel in 80 years, a statistic that only emphasized how extraordinary and preventable his tragedy had been. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Scientists studying shark attacks around the world had begun to notice a disturbing pattern, one that would fundamentally change how we understood the relationship between humans and these ancient predators. Professor Eric Kluwer of PSL University in France had been examining shark encounter records from French Polynesia, comparing incidents from 2009 to 2023. What he discovered would send shockwaves through the marine biology community and expose the deadly consequences of social media's influence on human behavior. Of the 74 shark bites recorded during this period, approximately 5% were found to be defensive responses, sharks reacting to being touched, grabbed, or otherwise harassed by humans seeking the perfect photo opportunity. These weren't unprovoked attacks by mindless killing machines. They were the predictable responses of wild animals being molested by people who had been conditioned to believe sharks were harmless. I don't encourage, as many influencers do on social networks, people to cling to a shark's dorsal fin or stroke it under the pretext of proving that they are harmless, Professor Kluwer told reporters. His words carried the weight of scientific evidence that social media was literally getting people killed. The pattern was clear and terrifying. Influencers were posting videos of themselves touching sharks, swimming with them, even grabbing their dorsal fins. Their millions of followers were watching these encounters and drawing the conclusion that sharks were safe, approachable creatures that pose no threat to humans. But the sharks themselves told a different story. When Professor Kluwer's team analyzed the global shark attack files, a database containing records dating back to the 1800s, they identified more than 300 incidents that followed the same defensive pattern. Humans approaching sharks. Humans touching sharks. Sharks responding with the only language they knew: violence. The defensive bites were typically sudden and involved multiple attacks, but ironically, they usually resulted in only superficial wounds. Unlike true predatory attacks, where sharks followed a recognizable hunting sequence, these defensive responses happened without warning. The sharks weren't trying to eat their victims. They were simply trying to make the harassment stop. Professor Kluwer made a chilling comparison that put the entire phenomenon into perspective. People know the difference between a Yorkshire Terrier and a pit bull, whereas they don't know the difference between a blacktip reef shark and a bull shark, which are their marine equivalents. The implications were staggering. Social media had created a generation of people who would never dream of approaching a strange dog and grabbing its tail, but who thought nothing of swimming up to a wild shark and touching its dorsal fin. The statistics that Professor Kluwer cited painted an even more disturbing picture. Sharks were responsible for fewer than 10 human deaths worldwide each year, while dogs killed more than 10,000 people annually. Yet, sharks were universally feared, while dogs were beloved pets. The perception bias was so extreme that people had lost all sense of appropriate caution around apex predators. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source, a 2020 study that found more people died taking selfies each year than were killed by sharks. The very act of seeking the perfect photo, the driving force behind so many shark encounters, was statistically more dangerous than the predators themselves. The influencer phenomenon had created a perfect storm of deadly misconceptions. Celebrities like Kiara, Bella Thorne, Zac Efron, and Will Smith had all been photographed swimming with sharks, their images shared millions of times across social media platforms. Each post reinforced the message that sharks were safe, that getting close to them was not only possible, but desirable. Wildlife photographer Taylor Cunningham embodied this dangerous trend. Her Instagram profile stated simply, "I just want to swim with sharks and take pictures of cool animals." Her videos showed her grabbing the noses of tiger sharks as they swam toward her, treating apex predators like underwater puppies. "The sharks don't give a fucks about me, which absolutely makes me a crazy shark lady," she proclaimed in one video, seemingly oblivious to the fact that her casual dismissal of danger was being watched by thousands of impressionable followers. Andriana Fragola, posting as Andriana Marine to her 450,000 followers, described herself as a conservationist while regularly sharing footage of herself touching sharks. Her advice to followers was to leave the water as soon as possible after a close encounter, but her own behavior suggested the opposite. "I would say at least 90% of the time with me, for sharks, eye contact alone is all that I need to get them to turn away from me," she claimed, promoting the dangerous myth that sharks could be controlled through human body language. These influencers had created an entire genre of content based on the false premise that sharks were misunderstood gentle giants. Their followers, numbering in the millions, were absorbing these messages and translating them into real-world behavior that was getting people killed and maimed. The case of Ocean Ramsey remained the most controversial. Despite criticism from the scientific community, she continued to defend her actions, claiming she was protecting both the sharks and other people in the water. But her critics saw something else entirely: a dangerous narcissist using apex predators as props for her own self-promotion. "This is not shark advocacy, it is selfish self-promotion," marine biologist Michael Domeyer had written after analyzing Ramsey's videos. His frame-by-frame examination revealed that her claims of gently redirecting the shark didn't match the footage, which clearly showed her pursuing and touching the massive predator. The scientific community's response was unanimous and damning. David Schiffman's words echoed the sentiments of researchers worldwide. There is absolutely no reason for this person to grab and attempt to ride a free swimming animal. It doesn't show that sharks aren't dangerous. It shows that some humans make bad choices. But the damage was already done. The videos had been shared millions of times. The message had been received by countless people who now believed that swimming with sharks was not only safe, but somehow noble, a way to prove that humans and apex predators could coexist in harmony. The tragic irony was that these influencers claimed to be helping sharks through conservation messaging, but their actions were having the opposite effect. Every time someone was bitten after approaching a shark, the incident made headlines that reinforced negative stereotypes about these ancient predators. When a shark bites someone, it's the shark that gets demonized, regardless of what human action triggered the behavior, Schiffman pointed out. The very animals these influencers claimed to be protecting were being further vilified by the consequences of the influencer's own reckless behavior. The pattern was as predictable as it was tragic. An influencer would post a video of themselves swimming with sharks, emphasizing how gentle and misunderstood these creatures were. Their followers would see the footage and decide to seek out their own shark encounters. When things went wrong, as they inevitably did, the resulting attacks would be reported as unprovoked incidents of shark aggression. The media coverage rarely mentioned that the victims had been attempting to photograph or touch the sharks. The narrative remained focused on the supposed danger posed by these apex predators, completely ignoring the human behavior that had triggered the defensive responses. This cycle was destroying decades of legitimate conservation work. Marine biologists who had spent their careers studying shark behavior and advocating for protection of these vulnerable species found their efforts undermined by social media personalities who treated apex predators like photo props. The real tragedy was that sharks genuinely needed protection. Many species were endangered due to overfishing, habitat destruction, and the brutal practice of shark finning. Climate change was altering ocean ecosystems in ways that threatened shark populations worldwide. These were the issues that conservationists should have been highlighting. Instead, the conversation had been hijacked by influencers seeking viral fame. The complex realities of shark conservation had been reduced to simplistic messages about how misunderstood these predators were, completely ignoring the legitimate reasons why humans should maintain respectful distance from apex predators. The scientific evidence was overwhelming. Professor Kluwer's research had definitively proven that social media was contributing to an increase in shark attacks by encouraging dangerous human behavior. But the influencers and their followers seemed immune to facts, logic, or the mounting body count. The defensive bite pattern that Kluwer had identified was becoming increasingly common. Smaller sharks like blacktip reef sharks, lemon sharks, and nurse sharks, species that had rarely been involved in attacks on humans, were now biting people who approached them for photographs. These weren't the massive great whites or bull sharks that dominated shark attack headlines. These were relatively small predators that had been minding their own business until humans decided to treat them like underwater celebrities. The bites typically involved multiple attacks but resulted in superficial wounds, exactly what would be expected from a defensive response rather than a predatory attack. The sharks weren't trying to eat their victims. They were simply trying to escape from unwanted human contact. But even superficial shark bites could be devastating. The bacteria in shark mouths could cause serious infections. The psychological trauma of being attacked by a predator could last a lifetime. And in some cases, like the Canadian tourist in Turks and Caicos, the injuries were life-altering. The woman who lost both hands while trying to photograph a shark would never again experience the simple pleasure of holding her loved ones. Her pursuit of the perfect selfie had cost her the basic human ability to touch and manipulate her environment. She had become a living symbol of social media's deadly influence on human behavior. Barakzak's children would grow up without their father, killed while trying to capture footage that he hoped would showcase the beauty of marine life. His death had been preventable, the result of social media conditioning that had convinced him sharks were safe to approach. These weren't abstract statistics or hypothetical scenarios. These were real people whose lives had been destroyed by the toxic combination of social media influence and apex predator encounters. The most disturbing aspect of the influencer phenomenon was how it had corrupted the legitimate field of marine biology. Real scientists who had dedicated their careers to studying shark behavior were being overshadowed by social media personalities with no formal training but millions of followers. Ocean Ramsey called herself a marine biologist, but her actions contradicted everything that legitimate researchers knew about shark behavior. Her willingness to touch and pursue wild sharks violated every principle of ethical wildlife interaction that had been developed over decades of scientific study. If you go shark diving almost anywhere in the world with a legitimate, respected shark diving operator, the very first thing they will tell you is, "Do not touch the sharks," Michael Domeyer had pointed out. This wasn't arbitrary caution. It was based on scientific understanding of shark behavior and the recognition that human contact could stress these apex predators. But legitimate scientific voices were being drowned out by the viral reach of influencer content. A carefully researched paper on shark behavior might be read by hundreds of people in the scientific community. An influencer's video of themselves touching a shark would be viewed by millions. The disparity in reach meant that accurate information about shark behavior was being overwhelmed by dangerous misinformation. Young people, in particular, were getting their understanding of marine life from social media rather than from legitimate educational sources. The consequences extended beyond individual safety. The influencer phenomenon was undermining public understanding of basic ecological principles. The idea that wild animals should be observed but not touched, a fundamental concept in wildlife conservation, was being eroded by social media content that celebrated direct interaction with apex predators. This corruption of scientific messaging was particularly dangerous because it came wrapped in the language of conservation. Influencers claimed they were helping sharks by showing how gentle they were, but they were actually promoting behavior that put both humans and sharks at risk. The global nature of social media meant that dangerous trends could spread instantly across continents. A video posted by an influencer in Hawaii could inspire copycat behavior in Australia, South Africa, or the Caribbean within hours. The case studies were mounting. In French Polynesia, Professor Kluwer's research had documented the increase in defensive shark bites. In Israel, Barak Zak had died trying to film sharks. In Turks and Caicos, a tourist had lost both hands attempting to photograph a bull shark. Each incident followed the same pattern. People influenced by social media content approaching sharks for photographs or videos, and sharks responding defensively to unwanted human contact. The geographic spread of these incidents demonstrated that this wasn't a localized problem or a cultural phenomenon limited to certain regions. Social media had created a global culture of dangerous wildlife interaction that transcended national boundaries and local customs. Tourism operators in shark diving destinations were reporting increasing numbers of clients who expected to be able to touch or closely approach sharks, inspired by influencer content they had seen online. Professional dive guides found themselves in the difficult position of having to explain why their safety protocols were more restrictive than what people had seen on social media. The economic implications were significant. Shark diving tourism was a multi-million-dollar industry that provided crucial income for coastal communities worldwide. But the industry depended on sustainable practices that didn't stress or endanger the sharks that tourists came to see. Influencer behavior threatened this delicate balance. If sharks in popular diving destinations became aggressive due to repeated harassment by humans seeking photographs, the entire tourism industry could collapse. The animals that communities depended on for economic survival could be driven away or forced to defend themselves against increasingly bold human intrusion. The response from the scientific community was swift and unequivocal. Marine biologists worldwide began speaking out against the dangerous trends promoted by social media influencers. Enjoy its beauty, but remember they are wild animals, predators that can act as predators, Professor Kluwer warned. It is not only a matter of safety, but also of respect. This concept of respect was central to the scientific criticism of influencer behavior. Legitimate researchers understood that apex predators deserved the same respect as any other dangerous wild animal. The idea of grabbing a shark's dorsal fin was as absurd as approaching a wild lion or grizzly bear. Michael Domeyer's comparison was particularly apt. If you go on a safari in Botswana, you don't grab onto the mane of a lion and let it drag you around. You just don't do that. The scientific consensus was clear. There needed to be a balance between the old Jaws mentality that demonized all sharks and the new social media trend that treated them as harmless pets. Sharks deserved respect as apex predators, dangerous but not evil, powerful but not malicious. This nuanced understanding was being lost in the binary messaging of social media. Influencers promoted the idea that sharks were either monsters to be feared or gentle giants to be embraced. The reality that they were wild predators deserving of respectful distance was too complex for viral content. The scientific community's efforts to correct these misconceptions faced an uphill battle against the algorithm-driven nature of social media platforms. Sensational content showing people touching sharks received millions of views, while educational content about appropriate wildlife viewing practices struggled to find audiences. This disparity in reach meant that dangerous misinformation was being amplified, while accurate scientific information was marginalized. The very platforms that could have been used to educate people about shark behavior were instead being used to promote dangerous interactions. The psychological factors driving influencer behavior revealed deeper issues about social media culture and the pursuit of viral fame. The need for increasingly extreme content to capture audience attention was pushing influencers toward ever more dangerous encounters with wildlife. The dopamine hit of viral success created a feedback loop that rewarded risk-taking behavior. Influencers who gained followers by swimming with sharks were incentivized to push boundaries further, seeking even more dramatic encounters to maintain their audience's attention. This psychological dynamic was particularly dangerous when applied to apex predator encounters. The margin for error when dealing with sharks was essentially zero. A single mistake could result in death or life-altering injury, but the potential for viral fame made the risk seem worthwhile to content creators seeking social media success. The commodification of wildlife encounters for social media content represented a fundamental shift in how humans related to the natural world. Instead of observing and appreciating wildlife from a respectful distance, people were increasingly viewing animals as props for their personal brand building. This transactional relationship with nature was particularly toxic when applied to apex predators. Sharks had evolved over millions of years to be perfectly adapted killing machines. They were not entertainment, they were not photo opportunities, and they were certainly not therapeutic companions for humans seeking social media validation. The influencers promoting shark encounters seemed to have lost sight of this fundamental reality. They spoke about sharks as if they were misunderstood pets, rather than apex predators capable of inflicting devastating injuries in seconds. The broader implications of the influencer phenomenon extended far beyond shark encounters. The same mentality that led people to touch sharks was being applied to other dangerous wildlife interactions around the world. Social media was filled with content showing people taking selfies with bears, approaching wild elephants, and handling venomous snakes. The common thread was the belief that viral fame justified extreme risk-taking behavior, regardless of the potential consequences. This cultural shift represented a fundamental misunderstanding of humanity's relationship with the natural world. For most of human history, people had understood that wild animals were dangerous and should be treated with caution and respect. Social media had somehow convinced people that this ancient wisdom was outdated. The result was a generation of people who had never learned appropriate boundaries when interacting with wildlife. They approached apex predators with the same casual attitude they might have toward domestic animals, completely unaware of the deadly consequences their behavior could trigger. This loss of institutional knowledge about wildlife safety was particularly concerning because it was happening at a time when human-wildlife conflicts were increasing due to habitat destruction and climate change. As wild animals and humans came into closer contact, the need for appropriate safety protocols was greater than ever. But instead of learning from centuries of accumulated wisdom about wildlife interaction, people were getting their information from social media influencers, whose primary qualification was their ability to generate viral content. The economic incentives driving dangerous wildlife content were also worth examining. Influencers could monetize their shark encounter videos through sponsorship deals, merchandise sales, and speaking engagements. The more extreme their content, the more attention they received, and the more money they could potentially earn. This financial motivation created a perverse incentive structure where the most dangerous behavior was also the most profitable. Influencers who followed proper safety protocols and maintained respectful distances from wildlife couldn't compete with those willing to touch sharks for viral fame. The platforms hosting this content also profited from the engagement generated by extreme wildlife encounters. Videos of people touching sharks generated millions of views, which translated into advertising revenue for social media companies. This meant that the very platforms that could have been used to educate people about wildlife safety were instead financially incentivized to promote dangerous content. The algorithm rewarded sensational material while bearing educational content that might have prevented injuries and deaths. The disconnect between public safety and profit maximization was stark. While marine biologists were documenting the increase in shark attacks linked to social media influence, the platforms hosting the dangerous content continued to profit from its distribution. This systemic problem required more than individual responsibility. It demanded changes to how social media platforms handled wildlife content and whether they had any obligation to consider public safety when promoting viral material. The international nature of the problem also raised questions about regulatory responses. While individual countries could potentially restrict certain types of wildlife interaction within their borders, the global reach of social media meant that dangerous content created in one location could influence behavior worldwide. The case of Ocean Ramsey illustrated this challenge perfectly. Her videos were filmed in Hawaii, but viewed by millions of people around the world. When those viewers attempted to recreate her behavior in their own local waters, the results could be deadly, as demonstrated by incidents in Israel, Turks and Caicos, and French Polynesia. This global influence of local content meant that responsible wildlife policies in one country could be undermined by dangerous content created elsewhere. A nation that banned shark touching within its waters could still see its citizens injured while attempting to recreate influencer behavior they had seen online. The regulatory challenges were compounded by the fact that social media platforms operated across national boundaries. Even if individual countries wanted to restrict dangerous wildlife content, they had limited ability to control what their citizens viewed on international platforms. This jurisdictional complexity meant that addressing the influencer problem would require unprecedented international cooperation and coordination between governments, social media companies, and the scientific community. The human cost of the influencer phenomenon continued to mount as more people sought to recreate the dangerous encounters they had seen online. Each incident followed a predictable pattern: inspiration from social media, content, an attempt to get close to sharks for photographs, and a defensive response from apex predators that had been pushed beyond their tolerance limits. The Canadian tourist in Turks and Caicos had become a symbol of social media's deadly influence. Her decision to approach a bull shark for photographs had cost her both hands and fundamentally altered the trajectory of her life. She would spend the rest of her days as a living reminder of the gap between social media fantasy and biological reality. Barak Zak's death off the coast of Israel had shocked a country where shark attacks were virtually unknown. His children would grow up without their father, killed while trying to capture the kind of footage that had made influencers famous around the world. These weren't isolated incidents or statistical anomalies. They were part of a growing pattern of human-shark conflict directly linked to social media influence. Professor Kluwer's research had provided the scientific evidence, but the anecdotal reports from around the world painted an even more disturbing picture. Tourism operators in shark diving destinations reported increasing numbers of clients who expected to be able to touch sharks, inspired by influencer content. Emergency responders in coastal areas were seeing more shark bite victims who had been attempting to photograph or interact with the predators. The pattern was clear, the causation was established, and the body count was mounting. Yet the dangerous content continued to proliferate across social media platforms, reaching new audiences and inspiring new attempts at apex predator interaction. As the scientific evidence mounted and the human cost became undeniable, a growing chorus of voices began calling for action. Marine biologists, emergency responders, tourism operators, and public safety officials all recognized that the influencer phenomenon posed a serious threat to both human safety and shark conservation. The challenge was how to address a problem that transcended traditional boundaries between entertainment, education, and public safety. Social media platforms had become the primary source of information about wildlife for millions of people, but they operated according to engagement metrics rather than scientific accuracy. The influencers themselves seemed largely immune to criticism, protected by their large followings and the financial incentives that rewarded extreme content. When confronted with evidence that their behavior was dangerous, they typically responded by claiming their critics didn't understand their conservation mission. This defensive posture ignored the mounting evidence that their actions were having the opposite effect of their stated goals. Instead of helping sharks, they were contributing to incidents that reinforced negative stereotypes about these apex predators. The scientific community's response was becoming increasingly urgent. Researchers who had dedicated their careers to studying shark behavior were watching decades of conservation work being undermined by social media personalities seeking viral fame. But changing social media culture would require more than scientific criticism. It would require a fundamental shift in how people thought about wildlife interaction and the responsibilities that came with large online followings. The stories of those who had paid the ultimate price for social media's dangerous influence served as stark reminders of what was at stake. The Canadian tourist learning to live without hands, Barak Zak's children growing up without their father, the families destroyed by the pursuit of viral fame. These human costs demanded a response that went beyond individual responsibility to address the systemic factors that had created this deadly phenomenon. The intersection of social media culture, wildlife tourism, and apex predator behavior had created a perfect storm of dangerous incentives that was claiming lives around the world. The question was whether society would recognize the problem in time to prevent more tragedies, or whether the pursuit of viral fame would continue to drive people into the jaws of apex predators that had never asked to become social media props. From the crystal waters of Turks and Caicos to the Mediterranean coast of Israel, from the shark diving destinations of French Polynesia to the tourist beaches of Hawaii, the same story was playing out with deadly consistency. Humans, influenced by social media content, were approaching apex predators with casual disregard for millions of years of evolutionary programming that had made these creatures perfect killing machines. The sharks themselves were blameless. They were simply responding as nature had programmed them to respond when threatened or harassed. The responsibility lay entirely with the humans, who had forgotten that respect for apex predators was not optional. It was a matter of survival. The influencers swimming with sharks may have gained millions of followers and viral fame, but they had also inspired a generation of people to gamble with forces beyond their comprehension. The house always wins in that particular casino, and the currency was measured in blood, severed limbs, and shattered lives. The scientific community had issued its warnings. The evidence was overwhelming. The pattern was undeniable. Social media was literally getting people killed by convincing them that apex predators were harmless photo opportunities rather than the perfectly evolved killing machines they had always been. Whether society would heed these warnings or continue to feed people to the sharks in pursuit of viral fame remained to be seen. But for those who had already paid the price, the Canadian tourist, Barak Zak, and countless others around the world, the reckoning had already come. The ancient predators that had ruled the oceans for 400 million years had not changed. They remained exactly what they had always been: apex predators deserving of respect, fear, and distance. It was humans who had changed, convinced by social media that they could rewrite the rules of nature without consequences. But nature, as these tragic cases demonstrated, was not interested in social media metrics or viral fame. Nature operated according to laws that had been written in blood and bone over millions of years of evolution. Those who forgot these laws did so at their own peril. The sharks continued their ancient patrol of the world's oceans, unchanged and unimpressed by humanity's digital delusions. They would be there long after the last influencer had posted their final video, long after the last tourist had learned the hard way that apex predators were not props for social media content. The only question was how many more people would have to pay the ultimate price before society remembered the wisdom that had kept humans alive for millennia. When it comes to apex predators, respect and distance are not suggestions. They are requirements for survival. These harrowing encounters reveal a chilling truth about our modern relationship with apex predators. From the bloodied waters of Turks and Caicos to the shark-patrolled coasts of Israel, we've witnessed how social media's deadly influence has transformed ancient predators into viral content opportunities. The scientific evidence is overwhelming. Influencers seeking fame have created a generation willing to gamble their lives for the perfect shark selfie. But these stories represent just the beginning of a much larger crisis unfolding in our oceans. Across every continent where humans and apex predators share the water, similar tragedies are claiming victims who never understood the true nature of the creatures they sought to photograph. If you found these encounters as shocking as we did, hit that like button and subscribe for more harrowing tales of when social media meets apex predators. Every week, we bring you the most gripping stories of human-wildlife encounters that expose the deadly gap between viral fame and biological reality. Because in a world where people treat killing machines like Instagram props, these survival lessons might save your life.